Okay, thank you. Good afternoon, and thank you, Arlo, for all your work this week, but particularly organizing this event in honor of Derek. As you know from the program, there are two other aspects to this memorial event. After I've spoken, some of the great writers who are here are going to read some of Derek's poetry, and then Derek's publisher and great friend, Jonathan Galassi, will lead a discussion between Jonathan, Robert Antoni, Jamaica Kincaid, and myself about Derek's life and his legacy. So I'll begin. Derek Walcott in America. Sitting on Derek Walcott's gallery in St. Lucia, I once asked him if he missed New York City. He looked up and he stared intently, and then almost imperceptibly he nodded. The truth is, my question was imprecise and badly formed. I should have asked him if he missed the New York of the 70s and his association with Joe Papp and the New York Shakespeare Festival. Or did he miss the New York of the early 80s and staying at the Chelsea Hotel and the frisson of his relatively new friendship with the Russian émigré Joseph Brodsky? Or did he miss the New York of the late 90s in the Archive building on Greenwich Street when he was commuting to Boston University and flying all over the world as a newly lauded Nobel laureate? Derek Walcott had many New Yorks, and all of them played a role in the narrative of his life and his evolution as a writer of verse that is simultaneously manages to be both stately and intimate. However, perhaps the most critical of all his New York sojourns was the 9-month period between 1958 and 1959, when Walcott arrived in the city as a young man in his late 20s. In October 1958, Derek Walcott took up a 12-month Rockefeller Foundation fellowship, which would pay him $250 a month and allow him to study drama in New York. He was particularly keen to immerse himself in the practical elements of theater, set and lighting design, and theories of acting and directing, all of which he might utilize once he returned to the Caribbean. He had first visited New York the previous year, when, under the auspices of the same foundation, he'd made a brief stop in the city en route between Canada and Trinidad. He had sought advice from theater professionals on the upcoming Caribbean Festival of the Arts and the play that he was hoping to write as a contribution to the celebrations. However, during his brief stopover, he realized that he didn't much care for the brash city, finding it to be loud, impersonal, and somewhat overwhelming. But now he was back again, this time for a whole year, and his seedy lodgings in a cramped room at a Greenwich Village itinerant hotel with a view of a concrete wall and a shared bathroom down the corridor didn't inspire him with much hope that his second visit to New York City would provide him with any reason to revise his negative opinions. This first protracted encounter with New York City and American life unfolded as one might expect. Walcott was lonely and at times confused by the foolish racial categorizations of the United States, which seemed to him to revolve around guilt, punishment, and revenge. Already, Derek Walcott understood that the whole idea of the American world, in its broadest sense, involved coming to terms with the fact that, aside from the various groups of Native Americans, everything had been imported, and one had to make something new and positive out of that reality. But there was both a clumsy and unquestionably stupid logic in forming a country which allowed their historical hurt to suckle at the national breast. He found himself in the company of writers, painters, photographers, and musicians, and was open to exchanging ideas and even manuscripts. But his worldview, and to some American eyes, his pseudo-British demeanor, baffled many Americans, both black and white, who depended upon crude categorizations from an earlier era to provide them with stability in this world. There were arguments, there were bar fights, a mugging, and by the late spring of 1959, the young artist was eager to leave New York and, after only 9 months of his fellowship, forego the remaining money and return to the familiar landscape of the Caribbean, where, later this same year, he founded what would eventually become known as the Trinidad Theatre Workshop. But what, if anything, did Walcott gain from this generally unhappy period in the United States of America in the late 50s? He visited plays both on and off Broadway. He attended workshops run by the famous director Jose Quintero, whose original productions of work by Tennessee Williams and Eugene O'Neill, among many others, had gained him worldwide attention. Quintero preferred an acting technique that was based upon the method, and a production style where the emphasis was less geared towards open, dynamic, free-flowing action and more orientated in the direction of the static and the psychological. The theater space Walcott liked the most was Quintero's own circle in the square, where the fourth wall was often broken down and the action would regularly spill out into the audience who were seated at tables. This fusion of high formality of interpretation and informality of presentation left a decided mark upon the young writer. It was in New York that the artistic and the practical foundations of the Trinidad Theatre Workshop were born, as Walcott thought about ways of funding and establishing his own theatre in the Caribbean. During his time in New York, Derek Walcott tried to write, but it would be a few years before his complex and troubled feelings about New York City achieved the detachment necessary for him to be able to write coherently about them. As he makes clear in the poem A Village Life, it was never easy for him to establish a work routine when he was perpetually short of money, fed up of enduring a harsh winter, cowed in an overcoat, and homesick. Somewhat ironically, he remembers a snowfall of torn poems piling up, heaped by a rhyming spade. But little of the poetry that he actually wrote in New York found its way into print. The principal journal of the Beat generation was the Evergreen Review, which did in fact publish A Far Cry from Africa, an early poem from his days as a student in Jamaica. But conversations with the village-based Grove Press concerning the possibility of bringing out a volume of his work led nowhere. As he writes in the poem Greenwich Village Winter, a book is a life, and this white paper, death. He was stuck, for it was clear that he didn't fit into the world of the American art scene, neither the supposed high culture of book publishing, nor the low-down beat alternative. He may have had difficulty writing poetry, but during his time in New York, Walcott did begin work on the play that would eventually become Dream on Monkey Mountain. But it would be some time and many drafts later before the work was ready for production. In the New York of the 1950s, there was, as yet, no discernible black arts scene, although Walcott's own identity as a hybrid, creolized West Indian and his determination not to stoop to the vulgar categorizations of race would have quickly situated him outside of the cultural nationalism of this development. In New York, by learning what he wasn't, Walcott quickly absorbed the lesson of what he was, a West Indian. However, by mixing in the circles that his fellowship and charisma gave him access to, he was also able to confirm to himself that he was indeed an artist, albeit a semi-invisible one. He was a West Indian artist, and if those around him in his Greenwich Village stopover couldn't yet recognize what this was, they were simply taking their lead from a United States of America which had no real notion of the Caribbean beyond the daylight come of Harry Belafonte's Banana Boat song. Of course, New York and the United States would eventually recognize and embrace Derek Walcott in the years to come. The disappointment and frustration of this first encounter would soon be replaced by a much fuller and satisfactory relationship as his career unfolded. Indeed, a little over 10 years later, the play Dream on Monkey Mountain was produced off-Broadway, where it won an Obie Award as the year's best foreign play, and then produced on NBC television. Suddenly, Walcott was teaching at Columbia and Princeton, and in the early 80s, he established the most satisfactory publishing relationship of his life with Farrar, Straus, and Giroux. By now, he was being recognized as a member of three distinct groups of writers. First, and most importantly, he was being viewed as a part of 20th century Caribbean literature. Whether it's written in English, French, Dutch, or Spanish, this Antillean literature of Ries, Césaire, Selvon, Glisson, Carpentier, Peirce, Marquez, and others, has written back to the classical world of Europe, often thumbing its nose at the post-Columbian vulgarities of caste and legitimacy. Walcott was also being recognized as part of a second remarkable group of writers born around 1930, who were educated to rise and inevitably bang their heads against the galvanized tin roof of British imperial authority, and then recoil and dress their wounds with the eagerly proffered gauze of mediocrity. But Chinua Achebe, Vivian Naipaul, Wole Soyinka, Kamau Brathwaite, and Ngugi wa Thiong'o, George Lamming, Derek Walcott, and others were witnesses who articulated the perilous spectacle of the Union Jack slithering down the political pole, and they were alive to the cultural problems, imaginary or otherwise, that opened up in this newly created national, dare one say, post-colonial space. And finally, Derek Walcott was being viewed as a provincial artist who had voyaged to the metropolis of the United States and found companionship with like-minded international provincial voyagers, most notably Joseph Brodsky, Czesław Milosz, and Seamus Heaney, all of whom drew deeply on the rich oxygen of the chaotic nation that is the United States of America, but all of whom knew that the brash republic was never going to be the soil that would ultimately receive them. On June the 12th, 1959, Derek Walcott asked the Rockefeller Foundation to end his fellowship 3 months before its natural term. In July, his brother would be taking 6 one-act plays by Roderick and Derek Walcott to Trinidad under the auspices of the St. Lucia Arts Guild. Eager now to escape the hostile hand-to-mouth, somewhat invisible existence in New York City, where he had endured a long winter and learned much about himself and the worlds of publishing, theater, and hustling, Walcott was keen to return to the Caribbean, where he was visible. His plays were being performed. His writing was being published. His future was being discussed with great interest. It was 1959, and much was expected of him, and he in turn expected much from the Caribbean. He sensed that in the Caribbean it was possible to be released from the punishing line of European tradition. He would, of course, acknowledge this tradition, but he would always refuse to bow down to it in a manner so prostrate that it would no longer be possible for him to see the creative forces all around him that had been unleashed by the confluence of so many races, so many religions, and so many cultures. He would refuse to blind his eyes to the uniqueness of the flora and the fauna. This was his world, and the Rockefeller Foundation could keep the remaining 3 months of their money, for he was going home. On June the 20th, 1959, Derek Walcott left a steamy, hot New York City and returned to St. Lucia. He was done, and it was over, and he was going home. Thank you.